I'm using a selection of carbon fiber splinters, which will be embedded in resin to create the gems. The molds are 3D printed from Sainsmart TPU. This filament doesn't stick very well to resin anyways, but I am also adding some PVA release to ensure that there are no adhesion issues. The carbon fiber splinters have been sorted by size and type. I have some woven and non-woven pieces to choose from. These splinters are extremely sharp before they're embedded in resin, so they must be handled carefully. I've mixed up a small batch of tabletop epoxy by Marine Supply. This resin is very clear, so it will be good for creating the gemstones, and I'm adding some of that into each of the molds. I've lightly heated this with a heat gun to remove excess bubbles. I'm adding a selection of the splinters into the resin before it cures. I have some time to work with this, so I'm choosing my placement carefully and moving things around until it begins to form a landmass sort of shape in the bottom of the first mold. For the second mold, I'm arranging the splinters all the way around the outside edge and leaving the center clear. I allowed the epoxy to set up before moving on to the next step. For this, I have a selection of small pieces of preserved moss and also some mica powders. I trimmed the moss into small pieces and arranged the vegetation over the carbon fiber landmass. For the second gemstone, I mixed some of the yellow mica powder into more resin and added this into the center. I also added some of the orange powder around the edges and allowed this to swirl together. Once again, I allowed that layer to set up before proceeding. I added additional epoxy over the carbon fiber landmass and vegetation, then swirled some of the yellow mica powder into that resin. Next I added some of the white mica powder and blended those together, keeping the top lighter and the bottom more yellow. I mixed more of the white mica powder into some epoxy and added drips of that over the top so that I could make the swirl pattern more pronounced. Moving on to the second gemstone, I used the same process, adding in additional epoxy, removing some of the air bubbles using the heat gun, and then sprinkling some of the mica powder on top. In this case, I'm using the orange. And this gets swirled into the epoxy, same as with the yellow and the white. I mixed up a small amount of the orange epoxy to swirl into the first gem also. The gemstones have now cured overnight, so it's time to pop them out of those molds. To do that, I've inserted some craft sticks around the edge and applied pressure until they pop out. The second mold needs to be trimmed before the item can be removed from the mold, since these carbon fiber splinters are extremely sharp and dangerous. When trimming carbon fiber, it's important to wear both eye and lung protection. I'm using a diamond cutoff wheel, which easily slices through the splinters. With the sharp pieces trimmed away, this can now be removed from the mold using the same method as with the first one. The gemstones can now be trimmed and shaped using a variety of sanding tools. The gemstones were wet sanded all the way from 400 to 7,000 grit. After sanding, the pieces still have a slight haze, which is removed with plastic polish. With the polishing complete, you can now see all of the variations from the carbon fiber, plus all the swirling from the mica powders and the small pieces of plant material that were placed into the first gemstone. These gemstones will be placed into settings on the mounting board for the Dragon Head project. There are a few minor voids on the sides which won't be visible in this project anyway, but they could have been filled with additional epoxy and polished flush. There are also quite a few air bubbles trapped in the resin, which could have been removed by degassing the resin in a vacuum chamber or by curing the parts inside of a pressure pot.